If you're watching this, I'm dead.
It feels like it was just yesterday when Gotham Knights was first announced. All the hype and excitement for a new Batman game. Sure, it wasn't the world-renowned Rocksteady studio that's practically perfected the Batman game's combat style and presentation, but considering the Arkham Knight was the last Batman game to release, and that was all the way back in 2015, almost 8 years since, and given the recent insane amount of popularity received from Insomniac Spider-Man games essentially keeping this type of fundamental combat system alive, people have been dying to return to play as their favorite caped crusader. And sure, it was a little confusing initially when Gotham Knights was first announced about what it really was, but as time went on, the overall concept was a little different, but definitely intriguing. Going from a single player experience to playing primarily as our favorite caped vigilante, clearly suffering from childhood trauma that's only soothed by handing out permanent physical impairments on those that are even slightly worthy of justice, to now playing as his prodigies in a 4-player co-op experience was quite a shift. The only real issue people seem to have leading up to this game's final release was how it's essentially going to be an RPG with loot and gear to level up. That, and of course the constant fear of it turning out to be just like the Avengers. But the ideas of the game were still, I'd say, great. We were given an open world, fully realized Gotham City with different districts, criminal organizations, and ways to get around, with crimes happening at night, and well, all the game's activity essentially going on at night. We're given some novel concepts with a seemingly new approach in a market that still exists, with the Spider-Man games being insanely popular as previously stated, and Insomniac working on a Wolverine game that I'd imagine to have a similar combat approach. This type of gameplay with superheroes and IPs that already exist aren't going anywhere anytime soon, and while the Spider-Man games, the Middle-earth titles, and I'd say to some sort of degree Ghost of Tsushima, since that game involves parrying, blocking, dodging, and execution that's pretty similar, but it's still hard to beat the originals. And while the previously mentioned titles execute their combat phenomenally well, they still can't hold a candle to the Arkham game's fluidity. At least in my eyes. I may be a little biased here, but Arkham Knight's combat is just buttery smooth. But we're not here to talk about the Arkham series or even the other games I just mentioned. No, we're here to discuss the most sadly confusing game I have recently played. A game with so much potential that it's confusing how they dropped the ball so drastically. Gotham Knights. Now before I talk of my experience, I just wanted to say this. I refuse to listen to any reviews on this game. It was a DC themed game with combat similar to games I absolutely love to play. All the gameplay footage I seen seemed to be fun. I couldn't see why it wasn't, as the presentation of it seemed great and fun. And as the old saying goes, if it looks fun to play, then it most likely is fun to play. While some people hate gear and loot and constantly leveling stuff up, I personally don't mind that stuff. If I was to lean any way about that stuff, I'd lean more for it than against it, because while an argument can be made that it will get incredibly grindy at times, as all things do, at least you have stuff to do and work towards, and you don't have to drop any real world cash to get that stuff. It just comes at the cost of good old fashioned natural sunlight deprivation, which most people are for these days. So I went into this game with an open mind. No high hopes or expectations, just a positive outlook and hopes I can enjoy it enough to spend some time as all 4 characters. So I'm not really going to comment on the story. I mean, it's not bad. Some people love it, others hate it. I'm gonna be honest with you, I was really just here for the gameplay and the combat, because that's what concerned me the most. Everything I was seeing on the gameplay and the reviews of this game, I just didn't understand like what people meant by the combat wasn't that good. Granted, some people loved it, and I actually found myself in that group after some time, but the complaints shared about its combat feeling off or repetitive, people claiming it just wasn't satisfying, that is where my main focus was, because just watching footage online, the combat seemed to be the exact opposite. It seemed fun, engaging, it appeared to be, for lack of better words, cinematic and stylish, and so I said fuck it and devoted most of my time to figuring out what that issue was. Why was there such a disconnection between what I was seeing and what people were saying? And what I can confidently say is after 15 hours, I finally figured out what it was. First off, this game's combat on the surface is very similar to the Arkham and previously mentioned games, however, it has a layer of depth the other games do not. And by depth, it's not really depth per se, as this game's combat isn't necessarily complex or overly complicated. It's quite the contrary. It's quite simplistic and oddly satisfying in its own way once you figure it out. For the first few hours of this game's combat, I absolutely hated it. It felt boring and unbelievably repetitive with the same basic attacks and same basic animations. And I was in shock. I could not believe for the life of me that a AAA game that looked this good really skimped out on the main focus of these types of games, which were badass concussion-inducing attacks. I was seeing the same basic simple jabs over and over again. It wasn't until I finally decided to look into this game's shitty HUD on the left side of your screen that you have all these tasks and objectives and rewards. You know, for completing a certain objective, you unlock certain things, whether that be color schemes for your particular hero. It could be some new mods, new gear. You actually unlock unique type of traveling through the Knighthood tab here as well. And what do you know? You get XP and more knowledge in how this game's combat system works if you venture into the training. And listen, I know what you're going to say. No duh, dumbass, if you look into the tutorials, you're going to figure that stuff out. Why didn't you just look into that tab already? Well, that's for a few reasons. One, this game's HUD and menu navigation is confusing and badly designed. It's a headache and chore to figure out and do. Two, there's nothing that immediately points out there's additional layers to this game's systems that isn't even properly communicated in tutorials of the training itself. The game gives the most basic information on how even to accomplish what the tutorial wants you to do. There's actual tutorial videos on YouTube for this game's tutorial, because the on-screen prompts telling you what to do are so damn basic. And finally, most people that are familiar with these types of games will just dive into it and never even look into the game's tutorials unless they get bored or frustrated like I did. And it wasn't until I figured out the perfect attack system that completely changed this game's combat dynamic for me. You see, the basic attacks involve you to just press square or X depending on your platform, and that's it. That's where the combat starts and ultimately ends, unless you want to inflict a heavy attack, in which case you just hold the button rather than tapping it. However, if you're trying to establish a combo, this requires you to tap the attack button right before your weapons are going to make contact with the enemy. As a matter of fact, if you mess around with it, you don't even have to actually touch the enemy. It's really all a timing thing. If you manage to do this in rapid succession, chaining combo moves, not only do you do more damage or see moves you've never initiated before, but you're also earning adrenaline faster. Adrenaline is required to initiate some of your more powerful attacks. If you properly initiate a perfect timed attack, your weapons will begin to glow slightly, informing you that you're basically doing it right. And with each heroes you play as all having different time windows for when a perfect attack can be achieved, that's where I felt the variety with this game's combat and how the 4 characters you choose from really stood out. This is where the challenge and frankly the part of the game's core combat I enjoyed the most. I went from feeling like every fight was a chore with the exact same thing done each and every single time, to being excited about the next combat engagement, trying to challenge myself to see if I can get each of these characters' attacks and timing down. It's just unfortunate it took me over 15 hours to realize this. If I was able to figure this out a whole lot sooner, I think most of my time spent with this game would have been a lot more enjoyable. In its own way, this type of combat is different and does provide its own sense of replayability, as it does require a bit of mastery. Personally, I loved playing as Nightwing and Robin most, as their timing was a bit faster paced and easier for me to gauge than it was for Batgirl or even Red Hood, but I did try all 4 of them. Here's the thing, while I am all for player exploration and discovering incredible things like this on your own without intrusive or annoying tutorial systems, with how this combat works and how much better the moves are behind this timed combo system, I wish there was some type of communication to the player where they told us more adequately and not put the stuff behind the incentive of just achieving your own knighthood. I think this game's stronger quality here suffered from that poor communication by the developers, at least from my experience, because most people would just quit and not look into this game's systems, which was this game's saving grace for me. I will also say this game thrives incredibly well with multiple players. I know that sounds like a no-brainer and kind of dumb to say, but I typically play by myself. I have people to play with should I want to, but most of the time I'm just playing solo, chilling by myself, and I ended up getting a random person with me. I still have no clue how I actually thought this game's servers were dead in hindsight, because in my 20 plus hours my game was apparently public the entire time and I only ever had one person join. He helped me do a few open world activities like interrogate a few randoms on the streets, progress the story, which was actually a bit frustrating at the start because he kept ensuring all my mobsters I needed to interrogate were brain dead, shutting off all my chances of finishing my objective and progressing through the story. But when we finally managed to work together, it was badass seeing Nightwing and Robin take down a few criminal hideouts together. I do wish that the number of enemies and waves were bumped up an additional 2 waves or so, with more enemies per wave as well, but I've found myself, or more so both of us, competing for the low number of enemies to engage in, and we were both pretty high ranked, so I'm not too sure if that was a factor, but it was disappointing to clear out hideout after hideout in a matter of just a few seconds. It did, on the contrary, help make boss fights much more enjoyable. As while the fights in this game are exciting at first, I found Clayface to be a little bit too spongy, and I can't tell if I was just being stubborn with how to take out Mr. Freeze or not, but holy fuck did I hate fighting him. He has an interesting moveset for sure, but that first fight I had to take him on was the first time I actually got frustrated with anything in this game. Well, that and a frame rate that still hiccuped on me every now and again, which I'm not too sure as to why. I have a higher end PC with a Ryzen 9 5900X with a 3080 and 32 gigabytes of RAM. The first instance did make a little bit of sense as there was a lot happening on screen. I had ray tracing on with everything else maxed out, so that one was completely on me, but there was a few other instances where there was less going on screen with the settings turned down to medium. It wasn't a constant issue, but it did happen enough times for it to both impact the experience and get a little frustrating at times, because it's coming up to 6 months after its release and my PC shouldn't have any of these types of issues issues. It's nowhere near the poor reviews that was a result of this game's initial abysmal poor performance at launch, but you would think this would be something completely patched over, as it was a prominent issue at launch. Ultimately, Gotham Knights is a game where there is still a little bit of fun to be had. It's nowhere near as horrible as most claim. I just think the poor HUD, horribly communicated tutorials, a bad reception at launch, and ultimately what at times feel like a lack of what they really wanted this game to be all hinder this game's true potential. Yes, they wanted it to be an open world 4-player co-op experience with loot and gear to find and craft, with this, for a lack of better explanation, a day and night cycle that plays into that combat loop. However, with there being no real variation in the crimes to bust at night, with the same ones being experienced over and over again, where the perfect timing combos saved me from the boring repetition of the combat, it was quickly overshadowed by the repetitiveness of these crimes. I wish they implemented some more variations and even some more infamous Batman villains as side content, some types of surprises and other investigations to explore and look into. And let's not to forget, as so many people have already stated, the progression in this game was an odd choice. I mean, all characters more or less do level up together. However, if you want to unlock their specific way to navigate the city, whether that be Robin teleporting, Red Hood jumping, or Nightwing using his glider, you have to redo their specific knighthood challenges, contributing even more to that grinding, repetitive feeling. Overall, I'm not entirely disappointed with Gotham Knights. I was, after hours of pretty much realizing it, more so a bit more satisfied with the combat than I initially expected I was going to be. I think this game is still okay with other people, and I actually recommend this game if you find it on sale. Personally, I wouldn't spend more than $20. That's including if you've already played all the Arkham, Middle-earth, and Spider-Man games and just wanted something slightly different yet familiar in its approach to combat. I wouldn't say this is in the same realm as the Avengers game, but I will say, as far as the disappointment goes and the expectations and the hype, it does kind of fall into that category. It doesn't deliver any of what it promised with the utmost confidence. I think they played it rather safe, and it led to a very mediocre, middle-of-the-road type of experience. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. Let me know what you think. If you've played Gotham Knights, if you're still eyeing it. If you have a PlayStation 5 and you have PlayStation Plus, I believe you can actually try this game out for an hour as a trial, which kind of sucks because the opening cutscene is about, I think it's like 5 to 10 minutes of that hour of gameplay, so kind of keep that in mind. But it's still something to look into if you're on the fence and you're on that platform.